Now I'd like to ask Brother Dave Robson to speak to us on why does God allow suffering?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So sadly, I'm afraid we can all agree that suffering is a fact of life that we see taking place all around us. There's a huge amount of human suffering in the world, and unfortunately there's a huge amount of suffering taking place right now that we see in the news each and every day. If we just think about what we see in the news that's going on in Ukraine, the atrocities that have been enacted on behalf of the Russian Federation have been documented for us all to see. People's lives have been ripped apart overnight. And unlike other conflicts, we'll be able to see this in the news quite easily and see the suffering which is happening like never before. And journalists are there and in Ukraine, and they're recording everything which is taking place. So much easier for us to see than it was in the past, and it's horrendous. And we can see here that emergency employees were working in a maternity hospital which was damaged by shelling in Mariupol last year, and some horrendous photos of a satellite view of a theatre in Mariupol before on this side, and then after it was damaged on this side by a Russian attack. And you can see that the word children here written on the ground, clearly hoping that the Russians wouldn't attack it, and yet they did. The United Nations has recorded thousands of civilian deaths in Ukraine so far. And so with all of this going on, and obviously there's much more suffering in the world than Ukraine, perhaps we might be thinking about suffering more at the moment. And why does God allow this to happen? And how can a loving God allow this to happen? And these are the questions we're going to try and discuss this afternoon. And because what we really want to know is, how can God allow that suffering to take place? Why does God allow that suffering to take place? How can he let such horrible things happen to so seemingly innocent people? How can he allow children to suffer from disease like cancer, and hundreds of people dying every day, people like you and I, from earthquakes, starvation, floods and natural disasters? And so what is our answer to these difficult questions? Mankind has struggled with this problem for thousands of years. The more you look at the subject, the more you realise how complex and difficult it is. If we think about suffering just for a moment, we think about all that it entails, and we see that actually it has two main parts to it. There are two main types of suffering, as it were. The people who have tried to answer these questions have broken it down into two parts to try and understand it a bit better. They've called it the problem of moral evil and the problem of pain. So what's the difference between these two? What's the difference between the problem of moral evil and the problem of pain? Well, if we just think about what's been going on in Ukraine to make it a bit easier for some examples, the problem of moral evil is people causing suffering. You might think of Putin, for example. If he hadn't have done what he's done and engaged on this act of war, then we wouldn't be in the situation with the suffering that's going on in Ukraine in the moment. We could say that he is causing the suffering to take place, couldn't we? It's all his fault. But then there's the problem of pain. And the problem of pain is the suffering caused by things which humans don't have control over. Things like natural disasters, diseases, tsunamis, earthquakes, those sorts of things. It's not a particular person's fault that these things happen, they just happen. And this suffering appears as it would occur even without any man-made intervention. So how do we explain these types of suffering? And these two problems together are called the problem of evil. And as I said, people have been trying to answer these questions for thousands of years, and there was a famous philosopher called Epicurus, and he felt that the problem of evil was so great that it presented a serious challenge to the existence of God. serious challenge to whether or not you could believe in God. And he was famous for summarising this problem of suffering in a short argument, which we shall just go through now. So this is what he said. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent, so he's not all-powerful. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent, or he's not very nice. He could stop the suffering, but he just isn't. That's not what he wants to do, which wouldn't be very nice. Or is he both able and willing? Well, in that case, if he was able to stop the suffering, and he would like to stop the suffering, then why is there still suffering? Why is there still evil? Or is he neither able nor willing? So if he's not all-powerful and he's not all-loving, well then, why call him God? So how do we respond to this? Well, I've not been able to come up with the answers myself. I've had to do a bit of reading, and I'd just like to point out that a lot of what I've said today has been borrowed from some of these authors. And I'd like to acknowledge somebody called William Lane Craig, C.S. Lewis, you may well have heard of, and somebody called John Lennox. And you can find, I'm happy to give you all of the resources if you'd like. And I don't agree with everything that they've said about other subjects, but a lot of what they've written on this subject I found quite useful. So there are different perspectives, two different perspectives that we can tackle this subject on. There's the logical perspective to the problem of evil, the problem of suffering. How can it be logical for a loving God to allow bad things to happen? Is it logically possible for a loving God to be able to allow all this suffering and still make sense? If not, then we have a bit of a problem, don't we? But then, obviously, there is the emotional aspect to this as well. It may be logically possible for a loving God to allow suffering, but we still have to deal with the emotional difficulty of this, the anguish of having to live now in a world full of suffering. And I think it is much harder to deal with the emotional problem of suffering. And many people eventually admit that it's not actually that they don't believe in God, it is that they don't like God. They think that God does exist, but they cannot stomach what he allows to take place. Hopefully tonight we're going to try and answer these problems, and we're going to try and deal with this subject in a sensitive way as much as we can. And hopefully we'll see that it is logically possible for a loving God to allow evil, and that God does not want us to have to live in a world full of suffering, and has provided a way for us out of this suffering. And ultimately that is the only hope for us. And hopefully that will help deal with the emotional side of this as well. If there is no God, alternatively, then what? What will bring an end to all the suffering in the world? Is science going to cure death? Is science going to stop earthquakes and flooding? The world is getting worse day by day, not better. The only hope any of us have is that there is a God. And hopefully tonight, this afternoon, we shall see that this is the case. So, the Bible is the most obvious source of help when dealing with this issue. And there's a book in the Bible called Job, and it's admired both by those who believe in God and those who take the Bible as just a literary work. And they say it's one of the greatest literary works in existence. And for those of us who have not read it cover to cover, the book of Job, it is well worth just going through it and reading and seeing what it says about this subject of suffering. And it's a book that deals very heavily with this problem of suffering. Job was a man who went through tremendous amounts of suffering in the book. And he had 3 friends who unsuccessfully tried to give him advice about what he was going through. And they got nowhere. And at the end of the book, what is the answer that Job is given by God? Why has he gone through so much immense suffering? Well, actually, to spoil the end of the book, for those of you who haven't read it, he isn't actually given an answer, but he is asked a question. God asks him this question: Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? And ultimately Job is reminded of where his place is in comparison to God, in the infinite wisdom of God. The message is that God ultimately knows what is best. God has a plan for each one of us who have answered his call. And the book of Job focuses on an individual, the man Job, and his suffering. And what we're going to hopefully try and do this afternoon is explain why certain individuals suffer. What we're not going to do is explain why certain individuals suffer. We're not always given an explanation other than that God knows best and he has a plan for those that he calls. That is what Job is told. Basically, it's who are we? God is in heaven and we are on earth, and sometimes we just have to trust that God knows what is best, and as hard as it is, we have to trust in him that things will be better in the long run. It's much easier, though, to look at suffering when we aren't going through it, when we aren't going through suffering ourselves. It is much, much harder for the person who's going through suffering in that moment, in the thick of it. It's not as easy at all. John Lennox says, the problem of evil, the problem of suffering looks very different if you are a spectator, theoretically trying to analyse the problem, or if you are the person who is participating in that deep and hard to understand suffering. So, what we say this afternoon, we are going to be saying as spectators, but that's not to take away anything from those who are going through suffering. It is incredibly hard. John Lennox tells a story about an Israeli couple he knew who'd once been believers in God. He said that they'd read a book called The Slave by an author called Bashevis Singer. And in this book, the author described a scene from where Jewish women and children had been buried alive. And John Lennox recalls how the husband of this couple who'd read the book said, when he and his wife had read that passage, with pain in their eyes, he said that in that moment the light went out. The light of their faith in God was extinguished, and they said that they never believed in God since, after reading those words and seeing how that was allowed to have happened. Well, what would we say to them? What did John Lennox say to them when they said that? Well, he said this. He said, all right then, there is no God. You've solved the problem. That's just the way the universe is. Or, as Richard Dawkins says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So this line of argument is saying that there is no good, there is no evil. Suffering is just what it is. This line of argument abolishes any categories of good and evil. And so it's actually pointless for atheists like Richard Dawkins to talk about good and evil, because by their reasoning there is no such thing as good or evil. It's just how we perceive it. But atheists do talk as if there are categories of good and evil. Why? Well, because they have, as we all have, an inbuilt sense of what right and wrong is. Whether we believe in God or not, when we think of the things that the Nazis did, like that couple who read about Jewish women and children being buried alive, we know that it is evil. Hitler authorised the systematic murdering of over 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe. And what we see going on in the moment in Ukraine, we know that it is wrong to see children being murdered. Was Hitler just dancing to his DNA? Was he just doing what he'd been programmed to do? We all know deep down that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. So in philosophy, there is something called the moral argument. And it's a philosophical argument put forward in support of there being a God. And it's related to this point about whether there is such things as true goodness or evil in the world. And the argument goes like this. It shows that there must be a God if we think there are such things as true evil and true goodness in the world. It says, so the first premise says, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. The second premise then says evil exists, and we all agree that we think evil does exist in the world. There are things which we see, and we all agree that they are evil, they're wrong. So therefore, objective moral values and duties do exist, and therefore God exists. In order for there to be an absolute objective moral value, there needs to be a higher authority to decide what those absolute moral values are. If there is no higher authority to decide, then how can we have absolute moral values? And something which I may think may be a moral value may not be what you think is a moral value. Hitler thought it was his moral duty to rid the world of Jews, but we hope we all agree that he was wrong. We can see that it was truly evil. And sadly, in this world, evil does exist. We all know when something really is morally abhorrent. But how? How do we know this? Is it just when we don't like something? Is that what makes it wrong? How can that be? What one person doesn't like may be the same thing that a person feels is just fine, just like Hitler. So therefore we need the existence of a higher authority to us which arbitrates between us and says, no, this is the right and this is wrong. Because there is the existence of right and wrong, good and evil, then we see that there is a God. So paradoxically then, even though the problem of suffering calls into question the existence of God, in a deeper sense it actually demonstrates God's existence. Without God, there wouldn't be a foundation for calling anything evil. C.S. Lewis, who wrote many books including the well-known Chronicles of Narnia, puts it like this: we wouldn't know what crooked was unless we knew what straight was. In the same way, we wouldn't know something was evil unless we had a standard of true goodness to compare it to, a standard from which that evil entity had departed from to make it evil. And that can only be the case, we would suggest, if God exists. If an absolute standard of what is good exists, then we know when that something deviates from that standard that it is not good. And it's ironic that the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, can't really be raised unless God exists in the first place to define what good and evil are. So we now need to move on and look at the first of our two problems. If you remember, we said there were two main types of evil, suffering. There was the problem of moral evil, suffering caused by humans, and the problem of pain, suffering caused by what we might call natural phenomena. So the problem of moral evil. Well, we can see that it was human beings that created the atomic bomb, wasn't it? Human beings created biological warfare that have caused numerous amounts of suffering. Human beings and the choices they make about smoking, drinking, eating, illnesses associated with lifestyle costing the NHS billions of pounds every single year. And the answer to this is that it's our free will answers why God allows this sort of suffering. Because if he didn't, we would all be robots. We would not be choosing to do what we were told, we would be programmed to do what we were told. God wants humans that choose to serve him because they want to, because they love him. What would be the problem in a world where we were all robots? If we didn't have the free will to choose to do good or to do bad? If we were programmed to never be able to do any harm? Would that be good? Would we be able to show genuine love if we didn't have free will? The problem arises because in order for us to have the choice to say yes, we also need to have the choice to say no. Or as C.S. Lewis says, in order for you to have the capacity to love, you also need to have the capacity to hate. And the free will argument helps with the problem of moral suffering. We can see how by allowing free will, we are going to end up with human beings that are going to be able to cause suffering to themselves and to others by the choices they make. But we are still left with what I think is actually a harder problem, and that's the problem of pain. what about the suffering in the world that isn't caused by humans? Suffering caused by natural phenomena, earthquakes, diseases unrelated to things that we do to ourselves. Why do some children get cancer and die so young? They didn't do anything to deserve that, did they? How do we explain how a loving God could allow this sort of suffering? And this is a much harder problem to deal with. And there are some good reasons for why we need to experience pain on a basic level. Very simply, if we didn't feel any pain, then we wouldn't realise we were causing harm to ourselves. For example, if we were burning our hand too close to the fire, if we didn't feel pain, then we'd cause more harm in the long run. If a child gets pain in their tummy, then that helps us identify that there's a problem and helps us treat it. They may have appendicitis or something else, and if left untreated would cause further harm. But let's remind ourselves of what Epicurus said. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not omnipotent or not all-powerful. Is he able but not willing, then he is malevolent or not nice. Is he both able and willing? Well then, why is there evil? Why is there suffering? Or is he neither able nor willing? Well then, why call him God? And I think this is where we get to the heart of the problem. William Lane Craig says this. He says we need to ask a question. Are atheists, those who don't believe in God, and use this as a reason for not believing God, saying that it is logically incompatible with evil and suffering in the world? That the existence of God is logically incompatible with evil and suffering in the world? If this is the case, then atheists have to be presupposing some kind of hidden assumption that would bring about this as a contradiction and make it obvious to us that these statements are not actually contradictory. Because it's not obviously contradictory for there to be a loving God and suffering in the world. We may not like it, but it is not. These statements on the screen are not actually logically impossible for there to be a God, a loving God, and for there to be suffering. No one has ever been able to prove that it is logically impossible. On the contrary, you can prove that these are logically compatible statements with each other by adding another proposition. And that is, and this is the answer I think that I found helpful to remember. If we can remember one thing from this afternoon, it's this: that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering, the evil in the world. And so long as this statement is even logically true, it proves there is no logical incompatibility between God and the suffering in the world. And if this is logically possible, then that means there may be a God. Then the suffering in the world does not prove that God does not exist. For suffering to be used as a reason to show that God does not exist, atheists would have to show that it's logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. And no one has ever been able to do that. Well, the next question that this leads on to then is a bit harder then, isn't it? Just what are the morally sufficient reasons that God has for allowing the suffering that we see to take place? If we think about it, they have to be extremely good reasons, given the amount of terrible suffering we see in the world. In order to answer that question, we now need to go to the root of what God is all about. Ultimately remembering that God knows best. But we need to think about what the Bible says about God, who God is, and what he has told us about himself. What is God's purpose with us? Well, the Bible, God's word, tells us that one day God is going to fill this world with his glory. That he's going to set up a kingdom on this earth and fill it with humans that he will bless with everlasting life, without any suffering. And if it's God's aim to bring the maximum number of people into his kingdom, how do we know that that wouldn't require a world that is currently filled with pain and suffering? Because maybe without any pain and suffering in this current world, we would not recognise that we need to be saved. That only in a world filled with suffering would the maximum number of people choose to come to know God and find salvation. Surely that then is morally sufficient reason for allowing suffering in the world, if ultimately it saves the maximum number of people possible. Do you think for a second that humans would still recognise that they needed saving if they lived already in a paradise, an idyllic world without any suffering, and still have free will? If we still had free will to do whatever we wanted, do you think we would all, if you look around the world today, suddenly stop sinning if there was no suffering? Are there any alternatives that you could think of that could be proven that would allow the maximum number of people to be saved with less suffering than what we see in the world now? Maybe if it could be shown that it was possible for God to have created a world in which humans had free will to do whatever they liked, and who went through less suffering and still decided to voluntarily love God and obey his commandments and follow his ways, then that would be an alternative. But if we think about that for a moment, that has actually already been tried. The Bible tells us that God initially created a world where he placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And when he did so, there was no pain. There was no suffering or hardships. Adam didn't have to work. They had everything they needed, and they had free will to do as they chose, to obey or not to obey. And so initially there was less suffering, and humans did have free will, and they had the option of obeying or not obeying. And what did they do? Well, we all know they disobeyed, they sinned. And so we see that the origin of suffering is connected to sin. Because at the moment they sinned, they were told, if you'd like to turn to Genesis 3, no need if you're unable to, but the first book of the Bible, Genesis 3, and it may be in a different version, but Genesis 3 verse 17. And to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." So what was the origin of suffering in the world? The answer is sin. Sin led to their suffering. What had been their sin? They had gone against what God had said. What had God actually told them? Well, in Genesis 2 verse 16 and 17 we read, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You must surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." Why was it called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Why did God call it that? Well, I think it was because it represented the test that God had given them. Would they choose good and obey God, or would they choose evil and disobey God? And this teaches us what sin really is. Sin is anything that falls short of what God has said. God is that absolute standard of goodness. He is what goodness is in all its forms and manifestations. And so to do what is not of God is a sin. To disobey him, to fall from his standard, or to miss the mark that he has asked us is a sin. And we learn from what happened in the Garden of Eden that God cannot tolerate sin because he is good, he is fair and just. He knows that sin is wrong, and so this sin separated us from God. Sin separates us from God, and that leads to suffering, to make us realise we need to be reconciled back to God. And that's the connection between sin and suffering. It does not mean that if we sin more we will suffer more, but there's no direct correlation between how much we sin in this life and how much we suffer in this life. It just shows us that suffering entered the world as a consequence of sin. Suffering in general terms came about by sin. So if sin separated us from God, how are we to be reconciled to him? What does the Bible show us? Well, I think this is quite amazing. Adam, as we said, he sinned. He battled with temptation. And this happened in a garden, the Garden of Eden. He gave in to temptation and sinned. And because he sinned, suffering entered the world. Well, let's come to the New Testament now. And in Romans chapter 5, we read in verse 12, Romans 5 verse 12 says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." Well, thousands of years after Adam, in a very different garden, different to the Garden of Eden, we're in a different garden now, the Garden of Gethsemane, on the eve of one of the greatest act in the history of humanity, another man also battled with temptation and sin. But unlike Adam, who gave in to sin, this man overcame it. Unlike Adam, who gave in to temptation and sin entered the world, the man Jesus overcame temptation and destroyed sin. Jesus knew he did not have to go through with the task set before him. He had the free will, just like Adam did, to choose to do what to do. But he knew that through his death, he would be able to reconcile mankind to God once and for all. And it was a huge temptation for Jesus not to go through with what he had before him. If we go to Luke chapter 22, we can see the agony that Jesus went through. In Luke 22 verse 42, we can see just how difficult it was for Jesus. He says, saying in verse 42, "Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Jesus was like you and I in that he went through the same temptations that we go through. But unlike you or I, he never sinned. And because he never sinned, when he was crucified, he was raised from the dead. Because the grave was not able to keep him. Because of this, we through him can have forgiveness of our sins and be reconciled to God. And so, in effect, this problem of suffering, this problem of sin, goes right to the heart of what God's plan and purpose with humanity is all about. It's right at the centre of what being a disciple is all about. Back in Romans 5, we see that this is explained in a bit more detail. Romans 5 and verse 6. "For when we were yet without strength in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." So as an argument against God, the problem of evil makes extremely ambitious assumptions that atheists cannot make with any confidence. But it still poses much more difficulty on an emotional level than it does on a logical one. Most people turn their backs on God not because of the logical shortcomings in the argument for his existence, but because they can't get to grips with the idea of a loving God permitting the evil that they see. And we see things happen to so many people around us, and as I said, it's much harder when we are going through this ourselves, but the emotions can often become very difficult to deal with, and we can't reason in the same way that we might be able to do when we're not going through that suffering in that moment. But we know that we don't like it, and we feel this overwhelming sense of grief and bitterness. But if there is no God, then there's no way out. But if there is a God, there is a way out, there is hope. And I'd like us to end this afternoon by thinking about something that Another author said in a book called God's Truth, written by a Christadelphian called Alan Hayward, and he asked us to think about the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ. If we picture that crucifixion, there was the Lord Jesus, but there were three men. There was two men either side. There were three crosses, three men all being crucified. If we go to the reading that we had to begin with, people today often exclaim that when they see suffering, if there really was a God, why doesn't he just put a stop to it all? Well, that's very similar to what one of the men on Jesus' side said. One of the men on Jesus' side on the cross said very much the same thing in Luke 23 verse 39. One of the criminals who were hanged there, just in a modern version to get to grips with it a bit more easily, one of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the man to Jesus' other side said this. But the other answered and rebuking him said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." And we can see all of humanity split between these two men, can't we? The side that says, "Why doesn't God deliver me from my suffering?" but never really chooses to serve God. And the side that accepts the problem of suffering, that accepts that God ultimately knows what is best. The side that says, "Remember me when you come in your kingdom." The suffering that we see in this world is temporary. It's to make us recognise that we need God. We see in Romans 8 verse 18 saying, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." And 2 Corinthians 4 verse 17, "For this light momentary affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison." So let's look forward to the time when Jesus will return to this earth and set up God's kingdom. And as it says in Revelation 21 verse 3 and 4, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away."